Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. Um, oh, there's someone on.
Yeah, you have some feedback. Maybe turn everybody off.
Yeah, someone's on. Great. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for joining us today. This is actually that was a perfect segue what Geronimo said. This is the first. This is our first TL talent workshop. And what is TL talent? TL talent is literally designed for those questions. It's, I had an opportunity to sit. I've been at home now for 7 weeks, like we all have, and you just start thinking about your work. You think about your life. You think about your skills. You think about, what's next for me. Like, there's going to be a post COVID-19 world. What's a post COVID-19 J? And what do I want to learn, and what do I want to explore in terms of expanding my skill set as I navigate my way through my professional life, and in my creative life, and in my personal life. So that's the impetus behind TL Talent, which is why we're doing this. And I think that as a first person who's here to speak today, Geronimo is phenomenal. So I'm going to introduce him shortly, but as a starting point, I'm going to do some housekeeping rules. So for the housekeeping rules, please, this was sent to me by Dustin, so I'm going to read them from my phone. So we're using Zoom today. So on the upper right corner, there's two different types of views. There's a gallery view and a speaker view. If you can click on that, that'll take you to speaker view so that you can see the person who's speaking. In this case, it'll be Geronimo. Please mute your camera. Mute your camera. Oh my gosh. Turn your camera off and mute your sound. We're going to have time for questions for the final 15 minutes at the end. And we're going to go and now turn it over to Geronimo. So to do a quick intro, Geronimo is amazing. So Geronimo is an innovation and marketing strategist with over 20 years of experience in helping organizations and individuals cross boundaries and expand their understanding of the possible. As Chief Marketing Officer of Manulife Canada until 2017, Geronimo gained extensive expertise in building and managing teams that bring new business initiatives to life by leveraging relevant content, technology, and conversational platforms to deliver a compelling brand message and value proposition. In 2012, he was awarded the Queen Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contributions to community and nation building. He is currently the chief strategist at global consulting practice Sunday Night and managing partner of Gusto Green, a global lifestyle brand with initial operations in Los Angeles and Toronto. He is also a regular instructor in brand management at the University of Toronto. So Geronimo, thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Good morning. Really, really glad to be here and have this opportunity to chat with you guys about some of my ideas as to what the future of branding looks like. To Jason's point, we've all had a lot of time and an opportunity to reflect on what the future may look like at an individual level, at a personal level. Today, I want to chat about what I think the future of branding as a practice, as a function, as a profession may look like. So the thinking here is that I will share with you some thoughts, a couple of models. I've got about 10 slides or so to go through, and then really come back to the room and have a conversation. So if you have questions or thoughts or comments or want to push back on some things, I welcome all of that. And I encourage you to type your thoughts, your comments, your questions in the chat box, so that we can address those and get going on more of a conversation, a back and forth, a dialogue. So let me just jump in. I'm gonna share my screen. So you can see what I have in mind. Give me 1 second here. We go. Okay. Jason, let me know if everything looks good at your end. Hopefully it does, in terms of the screen share. Yeah, we're good?
You're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so why even bother with this question of the future of branding, the future of anything? I think I already mentioned one reason, which is, we have a chance to contemplate, a chance to think about what does the future of anything look like. But on the other hand, I think we owe it to ourselves when it comes to branding specifically, to think about how we would like to communicate going forward with brands. There's a lot of experimentation happening today in this world of branding, if you will, with lots of organizations trying to figure out how to do that, how to communicate. And we can get into that as well. And I have some thoughts that I'd like to share in terms of what works and doesn't work. But really what it comes down to is this notion of there are ingredients, when it comes to branding, brand work, brand building. And I think it's time for us to rethink what those ingredients are. As consumers, we should demand more. At the end of the day, I think this is an opportunity for consumers to increase some of their power of influence, if you will, and for marketers and for brand professionals like myself, I think we can do better. So again, it's an opportunity for us to think about how do we do better? What does better look like? What do we owe to the profession as well as to society at large, which is obviously something that's top of mind these days, given what we're going through. So the point of view that I'd like to share with you is ultimately going to be a little bit provoking, but it's meant to suggest that what worked up until this point, it just isn't going to cut it. It's not going to work going forward. And so what should we be thinking about, and how should we be approaching branding and marketing even to a large degree? Arguably, one of the most well-known brands in the world, if not one of the most powerful brands in the world, is Amazon. And Jeff Bezos, the founder, CEO of Amazon, describes a brand as ultimately what people say about you when you're not in the room. And what I like about this is that it suggests that it's not just about organizations. Obviously, brands are also people. We are a brand. All of us are a brand on our own. And we act like a brand. We're often selling, when we're out there talking to anybody. And so in some ways, a brand is as applicable to an individual as it is to an organization. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we go through today's conversation, but just in general, that what people say about you when you're not in the room is as much about you, the person, as it is about you, the organization you may work for. And that's kind of cool in some ways. It allows you to sort of be able to relate to brands a little bit better, but it also says we should be thinking about brands as people. And therefore we should be humanizing brands in some ways. And I'll get into that in a minute. But I like the fact that he points out that it is really about, how people feel and what people are going to say when you're not around. So it's not really about, a dialogue that is controlled, if you will, but something that comes from a different place, a more natural place, when people express their opinion about you or an organization when that organization or that individual isn't in the room. So there are two sides to the coin, I believe, when it comes to brand building. And one of them is the promise that is made as a result of a communications campaign, or what people normally do when it comes to brand building from a marketing perspective, from a brand building perspective. But there's also the delivery side of it, the notion that whatever it is that you're saying, you better be able to deliver on. And that disconnect, which we do see sometimes in the marketplace, can be very, very tricky and detrimental. Why? Because ultimately brand building is about trust building. So if you're not delivering on your promise, you're ultimately creating a gap between what you say and what you do. And that's a very dangerous place to be in or to go to. And therefore brands should always be reminded of the fact that they should only be talking about the things that they can deliver on. And trust building is always going to be at the core. And what do we mean by that? Or what do I mean by that? I like a definition by David Meister, who's been around for a while and who's often quoted when it comes to trust building and the notion of trustworthiness. And what he looks at is 4 different elements of trust building. And the first one being credibility. So this idea of, do people believe, or the degree to which people believe your word, what you say. Reliability is a second component, which is this notion of the degree to which people believe you're going to deliver on what you say. So these are the 2 pieces that I just talked about, the notion of the say-do gap. On the credibility side, do I believe what you say? On the reliability side, do I believe that you're going to be able to deliver on what you say? So the do piece of it. But then there's this idea of intimacy. And that's a degree to which people think you understand them or believe that you understand them. So it gets a little bit more emotional. It gets a little bit more intimate at that point. And then beyond that, there's this idea of self-orientation, which is also a huge element of trust building. And that refers to the notion of the degree to which people believe that you are motivated by what's best for them. So whose interest do you have at heart? Is it mine or yours as a brand, as an individual, and that is self-orientation. And so as you move from credibility to self-orientation, you enter much more emotionally rich space or territory. And that's what this chart shows. And it's basically at the core of my argument today. But I wanted to unpack trust because it's important that we all get on the same page as to what trust building and trustworthiness is all about. So I believe, and this is really the sort of the hypothesis I'd like to put out there, that the future of branding belongs to the feeling function. It belongs to that emotional space, the emotional space that I just made reference to when I was thinking about trust building within the context of intimacy, within the context of self-orientation. And the reason I believe that is because, feelings are ultimately what drives action. When we think about a lot of the decisions we make, and it's often talked about in books and so on, including a book that I think is a great one, Tipping Point, obviously, which many of you are familiar with. But there's also a book called The Finish Line, and it's by a University of Toronto professor. And he does talk about this idea of like, at the end of the day, our decisions are emotional in most cases. And therefore, a brand may take us very far from a functional perspective, but if you really want to go beyond a certain point, you really got to get into the emotional space. And therefore, I believe very, very much so that the future of branding belongs to the feeling function, more so today than ever before. And I'll get into that in a minute as to why I think that's the case. It's really about stories and storytelling that impact the way we feel versus the way we think that wins the day. I like a quote by someone else that I recently heard, one of my good friends, and he talked about the idea that, the mind usually likes anything that is new, but the heart usually likes anything that is known or familiar. And therefore, it's much more of an intimate space, when you start to think about feelings and emotions. So if you look back, or if we look back at the funnel, the traditional funnel that is used by anybody who's been in the branding or marketing world for a while, or this has been quintessential. It's timeless branding, when you think about the funnel, the famous funnel. And what that means for anybody who hasn't seen it before or hasn't been exposed to it is that we always begin with this idea of awareness at the very top. And that's what the A represents. This notion that, ultimately we need to start building a brand by thinking about, how do we make people aware that we exist as a brand? Then, you move into this idea of interest. And interest is something that goes beyond awareness. I'm aware that the brand exists and I'm interested in knowing more about it. And then from there, you move into a place of consideration, a place of, I might consider buying something from this brand, or I might consider that purchase. Then you move into intent, the intent to purchase, the intent to actually transact with the brand, or be able to tap into a product or a service. And then you might do some evaluation, which is actually something that we do quite a bit of today, more than ever, when we go online and we look for reviews and opinions of others that have experienced the brand or the product in the past. And then finally, we get to that place of purchase. So the P at the bottom of the funnel is purchase. It's that kind of conversion piece. And this is a very classic, straightforward approach. It's been around for a very long time. It's timeless because the reality is we're still thinking this way in general as marketers, as brand building professionals. We think about, how we go through the decision-making process by understanding how are we going to appeal to consumers at each of these different levels in order to move them through the funnel, from awareness to interest to consideration to intent, and then evaluation and finally purchase. What I would like to put out there today for the purpose of our discussion is that there is a piece here that I believe is missing, which is, again, this idea of the emotional piece and the notion of the feelings, the feeling function that I was making reference to earlier. When I think about, the future of branding belongs to the feeling function. What I'm really saying is that there is a piece of the puzzle in the middle between consideration and intent that is really about the sentiment, the way I feel about a brand, the way I feel about a product. And no matter what a brand does, ultimately comes down to this piece, the piece of, how do I feel about that brand? And so it's a very rich space that I think
this conference will now be recorded. Muted.
Oh, sorry. I think there's a quick interruption there, but I really, at the end of the day, this sentiment piece, this idea of emotional, if you will, bridging between consideration and intent is going to gain a lot more momentum going forward, I believe, and bridge, a potential gap between the feel and do. So how I feel is one thing, but whether or not I'm going to do something is something else, and therefore, can we bridge that? And as marketers, as brand builders, how do we pay attention to the sentiment? How do we pay attention to that feeling function a lot more than we have in the past? And so to do that, I believe we need to have a discrete place for sentiment in the funnel, and just in general, in terms of our overall branding, if you will, efforts, or marketing campaigns need to pay more attention to that sentiment, that feeling function. And so in some ways, really what I'm saying is that feelings matter. They matter a lot more, I think, going forward than they have in the past. And why do I believe that feelings matter so much? I believe they do because ultimately, we as human beings are seeking happiness through the emotional satisfaction of any given number of things that we do, in our daily lives. But this endless pursuit of happiness, it's timeless again, and it has to do with the human experience. It's what we do, and I like to use this particular model, or if you will, this approach of the 9 fundamental drivers to understand a little bit better, as a brand strategist myself, where exactly are people looking for happiness at any particular point in time, or where does this brand, this organization, this product have the opportunity to build a sense of satisfaction, emotional satisfaction that gets people closer to this notion of happiness. Manfred Max Neef, who is a sociologist from Latin America, he takes Maslow's hierarchy and he says, I'm going to apply almost like a socioeconomic layer to it all. And in doing so, he comes up with these 9 fundamental drivers, which all essentially lead to action. So feelings in my mind matter because they lead to action. We ultimately make decisions often based on an emotional response. And he puts them in a bit of a hierarchical space. And he says, at the very bottom, of the list, if you will, or the fundamental piece has to do with sustenance and protection. And then from there, we move into a place of trying to satisfy our need for affection, and eventually understanding and participation and leisure and creation, identity. And finally, we get to that place of freedom. And of course, these can move around quite a bit depending on where you are in your life, or where a group is at in their sort of collective life. But at the end of the day, everything that we do ultimately can ladder up to, or can sort of relate to, one of these fundamental drivers. And so it's a model like any other that allows us to understand, categorize, how we could approach branding. And as far as the future of branding is concerned, if we agree, or if you subscribe to the notion that we need to pay more attention to feelings and the emotional drivers, I think these drivers are an opportunity to sort of figure out exactly where are people seeking emotional satisfaction, in which environment, and therefore unpack how you might be able to appeal to that particular driver. So they can be used as levers, in short. Now, if we take a quick look at, or think about COVID, and this is why I chose this particular model too, because I thought this makes so much sense to me. The impact of COVID-19 in the world of branding, I think, has been in some ways driven, or very much driven, by the notion that we've gone back to basics. I heard recently that consumer discretionary spending in Canada is down 85% in the last 5-6 weeks. I mean, that's a significant drop. I don't know how long it's going to take to bring it back up to where it used to be, probably a very long time. But the idea here is we've gone back to basics. So we're now thinking, once again, sustenance and protection above all things. If we go back to that list, that hierarchy that I just showed you, people are really now thinking a lot about sustenance, having to survive and therefore eat and have shelter and so on, and protection, protecting themselves from, in this case, the invisible enemy, a virus. And so sustenance and protection are top of mind. If you're not going to play in that space for now, you're probably going to be deemed irrelevant in some ways. And that's obviously a big statement, but at the end of the day, this is where most of our time, attention resides, subconsciously or consciously. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity to go after the other drivers, because the reality is we are going to get to a place where we're going to be paying more attention to affection, because we're actually almost already there. We're missing a lot of the affection that we normally would get from interactions with our friends, with our family, with our neighbors, with people at a coffee shop, with strangers on the street. And you can see that by the way that people are interacting with each other, even from a distance. There's a certain level of warmth that suddenly we're experiencing all over again, as if we were kids, playing in a playground in some ways, without any of the preconceived notions that we developed as adults, throughout our lives. And that's because we are looking for more affection. Collectively, we're there. There's going to be understanding and participation that is going to follow. And we are going to get to a place pretty soon where we're going to want more leisure, because we haven't had too much of it. We've had to give up a lot of things, I suppose. And as we move into summer, especially, people are going to be looking a lot more for leisure, and they're going to look for creation and identity. And ultimately, freedom is going to be one of those elements that we're going to be thinking about. How much more free or less free do I feel today? And that could be by the end of this year than I did a year ago. We're going to think about that. We may do so consciously or subconsciously, but these drivers are going to be a really nice way for us as marketers, as brand builders, as business owners, to be thinking about where are we at in this hierarchy. And therefore, what should we be thinking about when it comes to a message, when it comes to communicating in a manner that is meaningful, that is authentic, that is relevant, so that we don't lose the opportunity to build the trust that I was making reference to earlier. So in a nutshell, that's where I think we're heading. I think that's what the future of branding looks like. I think particularly as a result of COVID-19, we are going back to basics, but we are also going to start from scratch and building towards, with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, towards this idea of freedom, regain freedom, or regaining a sense of freedom. And we're going to pass through, affection and understanding and participation and leisure and creation, identity, and so on. I'm not going to get into any of these in too much detail today, for the purpose of making sure that we've got time for a conversation and dialogue. But I invite you to look them up. Look up the human drivers, the fundamental human drivers by Manfred Fried, and you'll see that there's a lot of information there that it can be very useful in thinking about where we are at as a collective, or in terms of a mindset. So the critical points before I wrap it up and I go back to a Q&A are, first of all, think people, not consumers. If we're going to be talking about brands as humans, and ultimately humanizing brand building, we need to think about people and not consumers a lot more. It's been happening over the last little while, so it's not something that should catch too many people by surprise. But the reality is we can do better as marketers, and consumers will demand more. That, I think, is a given. The other piece here that I wanted to highlight is that a driver, one of the drivers that I just talked about, is always going to be driving. There's always going to be a driver that you're going to say, this is what's going on right now when it comes to this product, when it comes to this mindset, when it comes to this audience. They're going to be thinking about one of those 9 drivers a lot more than they may be thinking about the other 8. It may be a combination of drivers, but it's a nice tool. It's a nice reference point to be able to go back and think about where are we, and how do we therefore leverage some of these, what are those triggers, and make sure that we remain relevant in our messaging, in our brand building efforts. And then the last thing I wanted to remind you of is that there's always going to be a gap, but that gap can be very, very small, and it's less so the say-do gap, with all due respect to Jeff Bezos and Amazon, a brand that deserves a lot of respect. But the reality is, I feel like it's more about the feel-do gap than it is about the say-do gap. So it's a lot more about this idea of converting or moving decision-making from consideration into intent through the feeling function, through sentiment. And that is, I think, what's going to allow for a lot of organizations to feel the walk, not just walk the talk. And that excites me, because I think that the world is ready for a different level of interaction, with brands. Consumers will want more, and again, marketers can do better. So I think I'll end it there. If we wanted to go a little bit deeper, I would say, having covered quite a bit of ground on why I believe the future of branding belongs to the feeling function, and what that is, we could talk about how do we make this happen? How do we communicate with the feeling function? And I love the work that Simon Sinek has done in the last few years around the why. I think if you start with why, you essentially have an opportunity to kick things off. But I would turn it around. I would probably do it sideways. I have a model, a thought in my mind as to how that would happen through a bit of a megaphone, if you will, structure that ultimately highlights how as much as why, because I believe culture and people matter a whole lot and will continue to do so going forward. But I'll leave that for the next conversation at some point when I get a chance to come back to you guys and once again interact. So I'll stop it there, and I think we'll move to Q&A. Oh, and one more thing before I do that. If anybody does want to reach me, feel free to do so through LinkedIn. Obviously, questions that we may not cover today or comments, or if you want to chat about something specific to what I said offline, I'm happy to do so. That's my email address, Jeronimo@sundayandnight.global. And it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. There aren't many of me out there when it comes to my name. So thank you, and let's turn it over to questions.
Hey, Geronimo, it's Lisa.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
You too.
I have a question about a brand. I'm on the board of an organization where we do a lot of in-person activation, and obviously right now we haven't been able to do that. A lot of our followers and our audience and our target, they skew a bit older. We do have a digital presence, but we're really struggling with how do we kind of make that transition from a lot of the in-person activation that we do to bring that online. What do you suggest as a sort of starting point for getting that going?
What's the challenge that you envision? Is it because of the age group that you just talked about?
It's partially the age group, but also so we do a lot of tours, in-person events like plaque unveilings and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of the things that we do in person. We've been talking about maybe doing pre-recorded tours where people can visit online, but because we're a non-for-profit organization, we rely on donations. And it's hard to get those donations online rather than in person when we kind of got the wallet out and asking for money.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'm on the board of a couple of nonprofits, Harbourfront Center and the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research, and it's challenging because a lot of what you're describing is experiential, and therefore it's being there, physically being there. But it's interesting because another thing that's very, very experiential is real estate, as we all know it, and it's also a very emotional undertaking, right? Like when you think about buying a house or even selling a house or a condo, it's a very emotional undertaking, and I would look to the real estate market because it's a business that relies so much on emotion and so much on experience to sort of see what they're up to. I have a couple of friends, and I recently noticed too that they're doing their virtual open houses, but they're trying to figure out how do those virtual open houses become intimate. What does that look like? Like, well, who can we put in front of the camera? What does it sound like? It's challenging. I mean, no doubt about it. It won't be the same as being able to do so, in physical form, but it can happen. And again, with say Harbourfront Center, I've been talking quite a bit to the CEO to say, I know that we can't deliver the same experience, that we would physically speaking at a theater or, at the Harbourfront itself. But we've got to do something because ultimately people are still eager. The one thing I will say, you've just described the challenge when it comes to being unable to do what you used to do, right? And so there's two things that come to mind. One, we need to let go of whatever we were doing before. It's just done. It's over, right? But the other thing I would say is people are in a very vulnerable state, right? So your audience is probably more open today than ever before for something else or for something new, because the sense of attachment to the past, I think, is starting to go away. Like we're at least coming to terms with the fact that we won't go back to where we were. We don't know where we're heading, and there's a lot of uncertainty that creates a lot of anxiety and so on. But at the very least, people are sort of saying, okay, now what? So you know what that looks like to me? It looks like an open mind. It looks like this idea of like, if you just give me something, I'm willing to try it. Like give me something, give me anything. And I think that that's universal for audiences because we are all ourselves experiencing the same thing. There's so many things that I wish I could do in physical form, but I can't. So I'm so much more open than I used to be to anything else that comes my way that feels appealing, that feels different. And even this, Jason and I were chatting before you guys joined about this series, the Toronto Life Insider series. And yeah, it sold out rather quickly because there's time. People have a little bit more time, maybe more flexibility. It doesn't have to be at 6:30 in the evening. It can be in the middle of the day. But also there's an appetite. We want to connect. We want to know, like, we want to interact. And so I'd say find one or two things you can do and give it a shot. And don't think your audience is the same audience they used to be, because everyone's changed.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Age group aside, which I think could be somewhat not determinable, but challenging sometimes for technology. Even that, it's changed. Everything's changed, and it's changed quickly. It only takes 21 days for a habit to be formed or dropped. It's been more than 21 days. So you can imagine the real change that's happening in people's minds, in people's lives. It's been over 21 days, and that means that there's fertile ground. To me, it's just so fertile. It's like, let's go out and try something new, because everyone's open to it, right? Like 21 days have passed. Therefore, there's this opportunity. There's just a lot more room.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And this is a question that we have from Lee. And Lee's question is, I'm wondering about focus groups and the importance of them, and if you have any leads towards focus groups on a large scale.
Yeah, that's a tricky question, because there's two schools of thought. With focus groups, the criticism always was, way before even COVID, right? Like that focus groups could, you create an environment that isn't natural. So even though you may get a bunch of answers that you think are useful or insightful, the reality is the environment is so not natural. You bring in a focus group together and you create something artificially in some ways, and you throw a bunch of information at a focus group and hope to get some answers that can help you understand what the opportunity looks like. So I get that there's some limitation with focus groups. I would say today with focus groups and this idea of the future of branding, because we're not creating those environments artificially as much as we used to, we can't bring people into a space and test an idea or a product opportunity. We have to do it through Zoom. We have to do it through Google Hangouts, or we have to do it online, and so the reality is, it's almost like the playing field has been leveled. We can actually now rely on technology in a way that we couldn't rely on technology before, because we had an alternative. We don't have an alternative. So today, I would say focus groups that happen online, large ones, medium size, small ones. I have some that I can share with Lee, offline, in terms of the ones that have worked for me, and the work that I've done in the past, has involved focus groups, and so I can do that. I can share some of those. But the reality is, I think today online focus groups are a lot more, if you will, insightful perhaps than they used to be. Because people are so much more used to interacting online, and because that's the reality. The reality is, it's not like I have a choice where I can choose between participating in an online focus group or sort of a live focus group. Nobody's getting together anywhere to do anything these days, right? So there is a window of opportunity today, I think, to tap into larger focus groups online, and do so in a way that is economically efficient, because those are much cheaper to be able to tap into than there was in the past. And I like that. Because at the end of the day, I think, again, it sort of levels the playing field. It sort of says there is no alternative. So therefore, this is common ground. They can be useful, but I think at the end of the day, there's also some drawbacks. Like there are opinions that are manufactured in some ways because of the environment you create.
That's actually that's a great segue into, I love that bit. Like, I love this idea of the emotions, the feeling, etc. And obviously in COVID, like, everyone is looking for that in their lives. Like, they're looking for it with their families, their friends, etc. They're looking for that connection. That there's that emotional security, satisfaction, etc. I never thought I would look for that in a brand. Usually the brand, the feelings we have for brands are, we don't like them, or we're annoyed at them, we turn off commercials, etc. So who's done it well? Like, who have you noticed right now during this pivot that has done a really good job building an emotional connection, leveraging their brand, and starting a new relationship, a new emotional relationship with their customers, with their audience? Who is this brand? Who are these brands, and what should we steal from these brands?
Yeah, good question. I haven't seen as much as I would like to see yet. I'm pretty plugged in, and to be honest, I haven't seen a lot of brands do a great job, particularly the more known brands, the larger brands. I've seen a lot of really bad, sort of strategies put into place. And we talked about one before the call started. And I think, the bigger players are struggling more so than the smaller players. So what I'm seeing is I'm seeing small businesses do an amazing job. Small, medium-sized businesses are doing a much better job than the big corporations, which is ironic because they have very few resources. Some of them may not even survive, but they're doing a much better job. I have a much better, communication thing going on with my dry cleaner down the street than I do with my insurance company, or you know what I mean, like, or with my bank for that matter. I mean, banks are so generic in their communication that no matter what you get from any one of them, it just feels, it feels manufactured. It doesn't feel real. It just feels like they've come up with a message that is one size fits all. So again, that's partly as a result of the fact that small businesses are generally a lot more connected to their customers.
Yeah.
They have less customers, therefore they understand them better. They have more insights into their customers and so on. But it's also because I'm more sensitive. I'm less tolerant today than I was before. I can't stand, a brand that comes through and tries to ride the wave and really doesn't have any business doing so. And again, I mentioned this to you before, but it's this idea of like, be mindful of your past. You can't just pivot onto something that feels good or feels trendy and try to gather momentum as a result of that. You have to be mindful of your past, meaning where have you been up until this point? What do people know you for up until this point? If you're not the empathic side of brand that everybody thinks they want right now, then don't go there. There's other things you can do from an emotional perspective, to gain some momentum, or to at least let people know that you care. So I've seen great communication coming from the gyms, the independent studios, amazing communication from them. Down the street, places like Spirit Loft or Form Fitness, Quad, like places that really, really know their customer and are suffering, are struggling, and are doing whatever they can to continue to deliver, a service, be of service. Whereas the larger brands that I would be associated with, I have found very disappointing. And that includes in the sort of the health space or the health and wellness space, Berries or Soul Cycle. Like, I think their communication is atrocious, like really, really awful. It's just so generic and void of any sentiment. The last thing I think when I get their emails is that they really give a shit.
Yeah, exactly. And we have a question now from Aaron. Do you think that this connection to feeling and sentiment will lead to a brand's desire to connect more from a cause marketing perspective?
Yeah, yes. The reason yes, the answer is yes. But no, the reason I was in that world too for a long time, the world of cost marketing and sort of community investment and so on, and I think it's got a tremendous amount of room to play going forward. But I think that we have to be careful not to pigeonhole everything that has to do with feeling and emotion into that department. Because that's a cop out. If we think that the only people in the company or the organization that should feel are the ones that work for the CSR department, then we're out to lunch. Like, we've missed the point, right? Like, that's not how this works. I believe that as a whole we can do better, and I believe that consumers should demand more, and therefore it shouldn't be just about the way we show up as a community builder. It needs to be about the way we show up as a brand, as a business, period. And I absolutely love cost marketing, and I am a big fan of anything that an organization can do in the community, but that is not where the feeling function needs to reside, at the expense of everywhere else. What I'm saying is that it should be everywhere. Everything should be approached, the same way that a cost marketing department generally would look at an opportunity. So they may gain more momentum, or sort of a CSR team may be able to teach a lot of things to traditional marketing, for sure, because they've been in the feeling space for a while. I believe that, but I would not want to see brands or organizations say, oh, there's an opportunity to amp our cost marketing program, or to invest more in the community because that's what people care about right now. Well, how about you figure out a way to service through your products and and your platforms, broadly speaking, not just through cost marketing.
That's I love what you just said there, Geronimo. Like this idea of, you know, like you see these brands with the cause marketing, and they have these large aspirational messages about, you know, we're all in this together kind of stuff. Yet, you know, with a bank, it's like, I love it when they return my call. You know what I mean? Like that creates a feeling that's
right.
that's a really good reinforcement. You're right. Like just being great, also
Right.
being
What you
great.
do. Yeah, you know,
It's
you can
important.
change what you do and stick to your knitting. You know, like nobody's saying here that everybody should be doing the same thing. And there's a reason why all these organizations exist, which is pretty awesome, right? That we have the opportunity to tap into so many different products and services, you know, to live our lives and so on and go after our dreams. But yeah, it has to be done in a way that has to do with the core of your value proposition has to remain as is, because that's what it is. You're not going to change. You're not going to go from doing one thing to doing a very different thing. You just need to sort of communicate different.
I love that.
I have a
Chantal?
question for you, Geronimo.
Yeah.
So there's been a huge focus on helping support local businesses, right? So local, whether it's your city or Canadian businesses. How much do you think that's going to impact the global market and other brands by, you know, within the next couple months or year or a few years or in the future? I feel like there's going to be a huge kind of flip as to where we're buying from. How do you think brands are going to react to that, you know, across the pond?
So across the pond or in general, globally?
Just in general, I feel globally, right? Like vice versa.
What do you think? You think that's going to happen? It sounds like you have an opinion.
I do for a short term. I feel like now more than ever we are trying to support local businesses and restaurants and everyone else. I think that there's going to be a huge push on other brands, especially on the marketing side, in regards to positioning their brand and having that emotional connection with someone that you've potentially purchased from before. I just feel like there's going to be a little bit more work involved in trying to gain that, you know, I guess connection again in the future.
Yeah. Again, I think you're right. I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, like which brands are doing it well. And I think the small, medium-sized businesses are doing a better job today than the larger ones. The larger ones, it shows that they're not built for this, right? Like they're not built to communicate this way. They're not built to have this type of intimacy with their customers. They see us as customers, as numbers. So this idea of like think people, not consumers, I mean, that is at the core generally of a small business enterprise. You know, they're thinking of you as a person and they know your name and they communicate with you differently as a result of that. But, you know, big brands don't work that way. Like, you know, it's volume, right? And so you see the challenge. And I think going forward, I mean, again, it goes back to consumers. I think as much as I love the trade, I love marketing and I love brand building, I think consumers are going to be so much more demanding going forward. They're going to determine, you know, what happens next in some ways. It's going to be a consumer-led revolution, right? As far as marketing or communications is concerned. So I think when consumers see branding or messaging that isn't authentic by a large corporation, they're going to be super quick to judge that, as we have in the past. We've done that, but even more so going forward. I think there's just going to be very little tolerance or room for anybody to communicate in a manner that isn't authentic. So I think the, you know, larger businesses will have a hard time, much more so than small, medium-sized businesses. The tricky part is that they have a lot more of an economic backbone. I mean, they can actually, you know, they can navigate this crisis differently because they're not going to go out of business necessarily. At least, you know, most of them won't. With small, medium-sized businesses, I think some of them really are at risk of going out of business. So I think in some ways, it's almost as if Mother Earth is taking care of that as well. It's almost as if it's saying, oh, you guys who made a bigger effort and have done a better job getting to know your customers, you have a chance to survive. Whereas, you know what I mean? It's really interesting to look at it from that perspective, you know, just sort of simply observe what's going on and realize that the small, medium-sized businesses are connecting. They're connecting in a meaningful way, whereas larger organizations are really struggling. So, you know, the short answer might be a large organization needs to think more like a small business if they actually want to build that level of trust and rapport with an audience. Now, how that happens, I mean, again, that's a topic for another conversation, because I think some of it goes back to this notion of start with why, sideways, as I said, you know, like it's the idea of turn the concept on its head and figure out a way to communicate authentically, but don't lose sight of your product, of your core value proposition. And I have a model in mind that hopefully I'll get a chance to share with you guys at some point through another workshop. But I think that's the trick. If a larger organization can think like a small business, as a result of everything that we're seeing right now, they'll be much better off than they would be otherwise.
Thank you.
That's great. And we have a time for one more question, and this is from Candace. And her question is, how can your discussion of branding be applied to your personal brand?
Well, I would apply all of it. Like, I wouldn't necessarily discriminate and say, oh, this applies, this doesn't apply. The reality is, I think everything that we've talked about, everything we reviewed, from the fundamental drivers to, the funnel itself, when we think about meeting people, new people that we meet, we become aware that that's a person that we haven't met. We may have an interest in getting to know that person, if you will, right? So we may consider that. But we're not really going to, ultimately, we're not going to become really all invested in getting to know someone or becoming their new friend or their new best friend or whatever. Or if you're in a dating situation, investing in a second date until we figure out how we feel. So it's almost like you're going through the process of a mind sort of exercise, which loves everything that's new. The mind loves whatever is new, always will gravitate towards something that's new. And so the mind will say, oh, so this is new. Okay, let's go. Let's figure this out. Okay, go. Boom, boom, boom. And then you're like aware and you want to consider and you might have some, interest, but you're not going to get into intention territory. Like if you think about the funnel, until you figure out how you feel, then the feeling function is really about the heart. And therefore the heart or the feeling function will look for familiar territory. It'll look for things that make it feel safe, right? And so much like a brand, an individual will sort of have to think about, how am I making people feel? It's not about how do I want people to think, how do I make them feel when I meet somebody, when I'm at an interview, and that's energy work, right? Like when you meet somebody, you just feel something, you feel good. Have you met them? You feel like you want to see them again. You feel like you want to hang out with them. That's a feeling, and that's an energy play. And that's where you want to invest time and effort, in building your energy repertoire, if you will, to be able to make an impression on others as a person, as a personal brand.
Wow, I love that. That's a great response. This idea of investing in energy as part of your personal brand. That's so true.
Mm-hmm.
That initial interaction is always a huge part of whether or not you want to see this person again, which I think is really important.
Definitely. And brands can do that too. I work with, as I mentioned, I'm a partner at a shop here in Toronto called Sunday and Night, and that's what we do. It's energy work. We call ourselves the alchemists because we sort of bring in energy into the fold, and we allow it to really truly be a significant guiding principle behind the work, even though we're still working with brands for the purpose of brand building or sometimes campaigns and so on. The reality is energy is at the core of what we do because we believe that it moves and creates everything.
That's great. And on that note, I'd actually love to explain. So we're going to bring you back. We'd love to bring you back, Jeronimo. So we'll bring you back to continue this discussion. There's just so much more that we can explore. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was really great.
Yeah,
and thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the members who came out today. TL.talent is going to be an ongoing series. We have some really awesome people lined up who are going to be talking about some more interesting topics like this. But this was a great start. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
And we will see you again very, very soon.
Okay, sounds good. Have a good day, guys. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.